They are deeply connected to the human mind. They manipulate it. We only see what they allow us to see. Our history, our culture, and even our technology are not entirely ours. We know what others have told us. And sometimes those others are not human. The word angel, in its etymological sense, simply means a messenger from someone higher. In this cosmic hierarchy, there are countless beings, from the mineral kingdom up to God. Humanity has its place within this scale, yet the ladder continues beyond us. But humans have fallen into the childish belief that we are the highest rung, with God immediately above. And so that vapor, that pain, that blood, that is what they, some of them, that is what they want. In ancient times, sanctuaries were expectant because God was coming. Today, do you know how that has been replaced? With a stadium full of people, the human brain emits waves. Now, 100,000 people in a soccer stadium? That is a flow that they, some of them, pick up.
What if humanity were not at the top of the evolutionary chain? What if behind religions, wars, economic crises, and suffering, there was something more? Salvador Freixedo, a former Jesuit priest, dared to say it out loud. Human history has been manipulated by invisible entities that control us from the shadows. He didn't speak from fantasy or delusion, but from a life entirely dedicated to observing, investigating, and connecting the dots that no one else dared to see. He was expelled from the church for telling the truth, silenced by the system for revealing the forbidden. Today, we will explore his story, his most disturbing discoveries, and the message he left for those capable of listening. Because maybe we are not what we believe. And perhaps knowing this truth is the first step toward liberation. Salvador Freixedo, the rebel ex-Jesuit. What if what we have worshipped for centuries as gods were nothing more than invisible farmers feeding off of us? Salvador Freixedo, ex-Jesuit and key figure in Hispanic-American alternative thought, dared to pose this idea. Born in Spain in 1923, he grew up in a deeply religious environment and joined the Society of Jesus, the powerful Jesuit order, at a very young age. He was a man of faith, educated at universities in Europe and America, with access to the highest circles of ecclesiastical power. For more than 30 years, he preached, taught, and founded Christian movements in Latin America. But something didn't fit. As he closely observed the church's inner workings, he began to perceive a deep disconnect between what was preached and true spirituality. In 1968, he broke the silence with his book, My Church Sleeps, a direct denunciation of institutional rigidity and the loss of spiritual meaning in the church. He was censored, expelled from the order, and became a dissident. From that point on, his search became radical. He abandoned official doctrine and immersed himself in the study of the UFO phenomenon, parapsychology, and non-human intelligences. According to Freixedo, many of the entities that have been worshipped as gods throughout history could in fact be beings that manipulate humanity from invisible realms. In his book, Let's Defend Ourselves from the Gods, he argues that these beings are not seeking our redemption, but our energy. In The Human Farm, one of his most impactful works, he suggests that suffering, wars, and oppressive religions could be part of a control system designed by intelligences that not only manipulate us, but may have lived among us for centuries. Freixedo was not trying to provoke, he was searching for answers, and the ones he found are not easy to accept. If Freixedo was right, then the strings that move our reality are not in human hands, and perhaps never have been. But who are these entities? And how are they connected to other researchers who also broke away from the official version of the world? the invisible owners of the earth. In his books, Salvador Freixedo argues that, by carefully observing history, it is possible to trace the presence of certain entities that presented themselves as gods in different cultures around the world. However, far from seeking our spiritual evolution, these figures would have a very different objective: to feed on our energy, not only in a physical way, but also through the emotional vibrations that emanate from fear, suffering, and submission. Freixedo even suggests that these beings could inhabit different dimensional planes, and raises the possibility that some governments may have made pacts with them, exchanging advanced technology and power in return for continuing to implement their agenda on Earth. This vision is shared by some researchers, such as the controversial British investigator David Icke. He argues that many figures of power, from political leaders to high-ranking officials of global institutions, are nothing more than puppets serving these ancient entities. Icke bases much of his theory on the ancient Gnostic texts discovered in Nag Hammadi in 1945. According to these writings, the material world was not created by the supreme god, but by a lesser intelligence, the demiurge. This false god, arrogant and limited, believing himself to be unique and all-powerful, would have created a spiritual prison where human consciousness remains trapped. At his service would be the archons, invisible entities that manipulate the human mind, feed on fear, suffering, and ignorance, and keep humanity away from the knowledge that could liberate it. Gnosis, the internal recognition of the divine spark. From this perspective, many of the ancient deities that demanded sacrifices, fear, and obedience might be nothing more than manifestations of the demiurge or his archons. And if this is so, the Gnostic texts would not only be revealing the true nature of these entities, but also a possible way out, reconnecting with the divine spark that resides deep within every human being. What if the key to our freedom is not outside, but within ourselves? We will explore this further later on. Non-human entities. Salvador Freixedo openly spoke of the invisible owners of the earth, non-human beings who, according to him, have been behind the rise of many religions, empires, and power structures. At the center of his investigations was a provocative reinterpretation of the God of the Old Testament. For Freixedo, Yahweh was not a supreme and transcendent being, but a powerful entity with its own interests, who chose a specific people, the Hebrews, to carry out his plans. He presented himself as an almighty deity with the aim of manipulating and subjugating them through fear, obedience, and sacrifice. This being, according to Freixedo, did not act like a loving god, but rather like a true cosmic farmer, an intelligence that uses humans for specific purposes. Yahweh's demands in biblical accounts were not signs of compassion, but of control. He ordered exterminations, massacres, and atrocious punishments for any disobedience. Moses received direct instructions to execute leaders of his people for having worshipped other gods, and later was ordered to annihilate the Midianites, including women and children. These are just a few examples of the many atrocities the Bible attributes to him. What most caught Freixedo's attention were the detailed instructions given by Yahweh for sacrificial rituals, which part of the animal should be burned, how the ritual should be performed, what should be offered. All of this, he thought, was not symbolic, but functional. It generated a specific energy: the suffering and fear of the animal, the surrender and obedience of the devotee, that this entity used for some specific purpose, perhaps as a form of nourishment. But Yahweh would not be an isolated case. Other ancient cultures described in the Bible also worshipped deities that demanded blood sacrifices. The same occurred in Mesoamerica, where the Aztecs offered beating hearts to their gods to feed them and maintain cosmic order. Why this global coincidence? What did these entities gain from pain, blood, and fire? Were they not merely rituals, but a form of food? Ex-Jesuit speculated that perhaps these forces needed that dense, low-vibration energy to manifest in our dimension. From this perspective, Yahweh would not be the one true God, but just one among several powerful entities that, throughout history, have manipulated humanity to serve their own interests. Many maintain that the Bible must be interpreted symbolically or metaphorically. However, for Salvador Freixedo, it was not a spiritual or moral book, but a historical chronicle, a testimony of encounters between humans and non-human intelligences that posed as gods. What if the biblical accounts were not the first? What if their origin lies in something much older, inherited from civilizations that already spoke of gods coming from the sky thousands of years before? The gods who came from the sky. In 1849, during excavations at the ruins of Nineveh in present-day Iraq, archaeologist Austin Henry Layard discovered the ancient library of Ashurbanipal. There, buried for centuries, rested over 20,000 Sumerian tablets written in cuneiform. Among them was a surprising account. The story of the Anunnaki, beings who descended from the sky, imposing and fearsome, known for their great stature, majestic presence, and ability to alter human genetics. They were not simply venerated deities, but cosmic engineers who, according to the texts, created human beings as a modified species to serve them. What is most disturbing is that many of these ancient narratives coincide point by point with passages from the Bible. The most evident example is that of the Great Flood, which appears with similar details in the Epic of Gilgamesh, centuries before being recorded in Genesis. Perhaps the very story of the Garden of Eden was referring to that genetic modification by the Anunnaki. Freixedo suspected that these similarities were not mere coincidences. In fact, he believed that much of the Old Testament may have been built upon much older stories, borrowed from Mesopotamian cultures. This connection between the biblical God and the Sumerian gods was especially uncomfortable for the Church and certain academic sectors. According to him, this information was hidden because it called into question the pillars of official religion and suggested an unsettling possibility, that religions were not born to bring us closer to the divine, but to keep us under control. This view gains even more weight when studying the heavenly hierarchies in Christian tradition. Seraphim, cherubim, thrones, dominions, principalities. What if they were not messengers of divine love, but parts of a sophisticated non-human power structure? The Book of Enoch, excluded from the canonical Bible, offers more clues. It tells how certain angels, called Watchers, descended to earth, took human women, and begot giants. The Nephilim. These angels taught men forbidden arts, such as sorcery, astrology, and metallurgy. Their rebellion was punished, according to the text, by God. But who really were these Watchers? Some contemporary researchers have directly linked the Anunnaki to the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, suggesting they might be the same entities known by different names in different cultures. If this were true, then these entities, whether called gods, Watchers, fallen angels, or Anunnaki, have been involved in a vast operation of manipulation and energy extraction since ancient times. And if they never left, are they still operating from the shadows? Could it be that today, Under new names and more sophisticated methods, they continue to control humanity. It's enough to look at the modern world. Endless wars, economic crises, global fear, slavery disguised as progress. Everything suggests these entities have not disappeared. They've only evolved. They no longer need temples. Now they feed on collective fear, daily anxiety, the suffering of millions trapped in systems they neither understand nor can change. But if they haven't vanished, can we find proof or evidence of their presence in the world today? UFOs, the gods in disguise. In Let's Defend Ourselves from the Gods, Ex-Jesuit presents a provocative idea that the ancient gods and modern UFOs might be the same entities, adapting to humanity's cultural and technological evolution. Yesterday they appeared as gods, angels, or demons. Today they appear as ships and extraterrestrial beings. They haven't changed, we have. These intelligences, far from seeking our evolution, may have guided religions, wars, and control systems from invisible realms for their own benefit. He even claimed that certain governments know of their existence and have secretly made pacts with them. Ex-Jesuit did not deny God. He believed in an omnipresent consciousness that exists in everything. But he warned that between that God and us exists a cosmic hierarchy of beings who operate as intermediaries or manipulators. That is why he warned, do not blindly believe or deny. Observe, question, investigate. Understanding this possible manipulation should not lead us to fear, but to a deeper awareness. Ex-Jesuit was not calling for defeatism, but for awakening. If these entities have influenced our beliefs, institutions, and perception of reality, then the true act of rebellion is to open our eyes, think for ourselves, and raise our consciousness above the systems of control. This is where the true purpose of the human being comes into play, not as a slave to external forces, but as the protagonist of their own inner journey. The hero's journey and spiritual liberation. Although at times Ex-Jesuit's vision may seem dark or challenging, his message was not one of despair, but of awareness. We are not condemned. We are not trapped without a way out. He always insisted that our mind and our consciousness are the only real tools we have to free ourselves from control and manipulation. We inhabit a dual universe, and that duality is not a mistake or a prison in itself, but a fundamental law of the material plane. Since the most ancient civilizations, it has been spoken of as a cosmic principle: yin and yang, heaven and hell, day and night, expansion and contraction, matter and spirit. The Kybalion, an essential Hermetic text, clearly summarizes it in its second principle. Everything is dual, everything has two poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Duality is the force that drives movement, that allows for evolution and learning. Without the night, we wouldn't understand the light. Without death, we wouldn't value life. As long as we are in this plane, we must learn to move within this game of polarities, not from resignation, but from knowledge. That is why knowledge, gnosis, is so important. And that is precisely what religions and elites have tried to keep us away from for millennia. Because knowledge liberates. But something is changing. Thousands, millions of souls are awakening. The internet, although it can be a double-edged sword, has been key in this process. We see how our attention is constantly diverted by infinite scrolls, by news spreading like wildfire, many of them designed to keep us in frequencies of fear, worry, and scarcity. And yet, it is also an immense source of knowledge. A way to connect with like-minded people, no matter the place. If we learn to use our reason and our awareness, if we filter information through our inner voice, we can access a deep wisdom that in other times was reserved only for a few. But it's not enough to accumulate intellectual knowledge. That is only the first step. True wisdom is found within us, in the awakening of that divine spark we all carry inside, in the profound act of remembering who we truly are. Ex-Jesuit understood it this way. Yes, there are entities that might feed on our densest emotions. Just as we consume plants and animals to live, there may be beings that feed off human effort and emotional fields. But that does not make us inevitable victims. We have the power to decide what kind of energy we generate. And there lies the key. If we live trapped in states of fear, anger, guilt, or resentment, we align with the lowest frequencies of the system. But if we cultivate love, compassion, gratitude, creativity, or peace, we raise our vibration above that influence. We stop being cogs. We begin to be consciousness. The Gnostics, in the early centuries of Christianity, spoke of a humanity trapped in an illusory world governed by archons, intelligences that kept souls asleep, caught in a cycle of suffering and forgetting. But they also taught that within each human being there is a divine spark, a sacred seed that comes from the true world, and that this spark can be activated through gnosis, an inner knowledge, not intellectual but spiritual. To know the truth is to remember who we are, where we come from, and where we can return. According to this vision, awakening is not an external struggle, but an internal rebellion. A sacred act of memory that dissolves deception and breaks the veils of ignorance. This connects deeply with the teachings of many sages throughout history. Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God as something that is within us. Buddha taught that enlightenment comes when one sees clearly. The alchemists sought to transmute the lead of the soul into spiritual gold. All pointed to the same thing: the awakening of consciousness as the path to liberation. And that awakening is not passive, it is deep work. It is the hero's journey Joseph Campbell spoke of. A journey of the soul that goes through trials, falls, rises, dies symbolically, and is reborn. Many feel deep down that they don't fully belong to this world, that there is something more, that they have been here before. Maybe it's true. Maybe we are ancient souls trapped in a cycle, but with the potential to break it. Ex-Jesuit believed that every act of awareness, every luminous thought, every gesture of kindness is a way to break the spell, to step off the script, to disconnect from the control system and reconnect with the source. Because even though this plane is marked by duality, our spirit is not. The spirit remembers, the spirit transcends. And by remembering who we are, by consciously choosing the higher side of polarity, we begin to free ourselves. That is the true awakening, and that is the greatest threat we can pose to those who have always fed off our unconsciousness. And what can we do in our daily lives? As we said before, gnosis is not achieved solely through books or theories. It is not a prize for the most learned, but a living, direct experience, a different way of inhabiting existence. To awaken, it's not enough to know. We must experience. To see what happens inside us and around us. To see what drives us, what dominates us, what lives within us. And for that, the first step is self-observation, not as a judge, but as a silent witness. To watch ourselves in the midst of chaos, in the midst of routine, when the ego reacts, when emotion drags us, when thought repeats like a sick mantra. To observe without rejecting. just to see. Because what is seen begins to lose power, and what is seen with light begins to transform. Next comes silence. Not external silence, but internal silence. A sacred space that many have forgotten, but that is still there, waiting. Meditation, as simple as it may seem, brings us back to that inner temple where the mind calms and the voice of the essential begins to whisper. The soul doesn't shout. It speaks softly. Only in silence can we hear it. Then comes discernment. We live in a world full of noise that imposes, that constantly bombards us with stimuli, opinions, and prefabricated fears. That's why we must ask ourselves, like one who questions an oracle, is this feeling mine, or was it planted in me? Does this thought set me free, or does it bind me? A sharpened consciousness is the sword that cuts through deception. But it's not enough to see or to understand. We must cultivate the heart, because knowledge without love becomes dry, sterile. True wisdom blooms when it is rooted in compassion, in forgiveness, in conscious love. That love which sustains, which transforms, which heals. That love that cannot be manipulated but does not harden either. And then, the disconnection from the noise. The system feeds on our attention. It wants us distracted, divided, irritated. Turning off the constant flow of information, stopping the endless scrolling, carefully choosing what we allow into our energetic field. This is a revolutionary act. To reclaim attention is to reclaim consciousness. And finally, to remember who we are. To remember that this is a journey, that none of this is accidental, that every day, every situation, every shadow and every light are part of the process, and that we have a mission to awaken, not from the ego, but from the self, to return home, to return to the origin. Because true awakening is not a theory or a passing trend. It is a way of seeing the world. It is walking with the eyes of the spirit wide open, with full awareness, without being dragged by the illusory game of Maya, that web of deception in which most remain asleep. By developing gnosis, inner knowledge, and recognizing those who pull the strings from the shadows, we begin to deactivate their mechanisms of control. We free the mind from their age-old traps and, by consciously choosing the polarity of good, of light, we transform our reality from within and project it outward. That's it for today's video. I hope this information was useful and enriching. Thank you so much for watching until the end. See you soon.